join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Daniel Sperling.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real pleasure because I now see that all of you students from Westminster High School are here from the science classes. So that's particularly exciting. So, because, you know, you're the one that this lecture is more relevant for than anyone. Us old folks, you know, we're going to be leaving in a not too far off future, and this is your world. So hopefully I'll give you a little insight, a few ideas how to make it better. So I am talking about just transportation and its role with climate change, how to make our cities more sustainable, our energy systems more sustainable. So as Jennifer said, I'm a professor at UC Davis, and I head up this Institute of Transportation Studies, which I founded over 30 years ago when I was a teenager. No, just kidding. But it doesn't make me feel so old when I say that. And so, you know, for some of the youth thinking about going to college, you know, the university, UC system, university college system really provides all kinds of programs that are relevant to what I'll be talking about here. And then when you're interested in graduate school, come talk to me in a few years. And so as you see here, like, you know, the institute that I head up, we're focused on sustainable transportation, but that means all kinds of things. I'm going to be talking about a lot of that today, but it also means not just California, not just the US, the whole world, because the whole world is dealing with the same questions about how do we transition from this energy system, this fossil energy-based system, to something that's more sustainable in the future. Okay, so, you know, I'm a professor, but another part of my resume is I was a board member for the California Air Resources Board for 16 years until just a few months ago. And so many of all these policies and laws and regulations I'll be talking about, many of them I actually voted on. So I'll, you know, actually when we get to the questions, if we can delve into some interesting backstories if you're interested. But part of it here is one of our previous governors. All you young folks, do you still recognize who that is? I don't know, he's getting kind of old too, so I don't know. So he actually, that was at UC Davis because Arnold Schwarzenegger wanted to start a hydrogen highway, you know, transition California to hydrogen. And so UC Davis, we were the first energy station on the hydrogen highway. It didn't really go much beyond that, but we'll get back to that too. So I'm a researcher, and I've been a regulator, so I understand the policy and politics of a lot of these things that I'll be talking about. And there's actually in the bottom corner there, that's Mary Nichols, and she was the chair of the California Air Resources Board for many years and has held a lot of other very senior positions in Washington, D.C. and California. She was actually a head of an institute at UCLA for a while. And in many ways, my mentor about all things political and policy. And as a policy wonk, so I like to think of myself, so I am trained as an engineer, but just because you're an engineer doesn't mean you're just building all those little Beckman instruments that you see in the hallway here. Engineering, you know, we need to take engineering much further and deal with all of these issues that we're talking about. How do we create more sustainable transportation? So there's economists have something to say about it, the political scientists, ecologists, but also engineers. So in my life, I've written many books that deal with transportation. You see two of them at the bottom there. I'm going to come back to one of them, three revolutions, because much of what I talk about here is about how transportation is evolving, what is the future, what's happening now, and what's likely to happen in the near future. And that's me balancing all of those data and science and politics there. All right, so let me jump right in and say, in the United States, we've created what I now refer to as a car monoculture, a car-centric monoculture. So that's borrowing from biology, but what it means is our vehicles now dominate to such an extent that they've pretty much squeezed out almost all other forms of transportation. So a little statistic I'll give you, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but mass transit. So let me ask you the question. Okay, so I'm a professor. I'm going to ask you questions. Okay, so what percentage of all passenger travel in the United States and in California is by transit, buses and metro and Amtrak? What percent is by all that transit? How many think it's more than 30%? Okay, no one. How many think it's more than 10%? A few people, about less than 5%. How many think it's 5%? All right, yeah, it looks like the majority think it's 5%. How many think it's 2%? Another about 10, 20%. How many think it's less than 2%? Okay, well, the answer is it's less than 2%. And so that's an example of what's happened with our transportation system. Our cars, when I say cars, I'm referring to all light-duty passenger vehicles. In other words, when I say cars, I mean SUVs, pickups, minivans, as well as, traditional cars. Anyway, it's squeezed out almost everything else. And now we depend on our cars for almost all of our travel. And so this transportation system we've created is extraordinarily expensive and resource intensive. So in the US, we spend $100 billion a year just on roads. We spend, for us as individuals, how much we spend on owning and operating cars, it's over $1 trillion per year. The cost of owning and operating a car is between $5,000 and $10,000 per year when you take into account all the costs, the insurance, the fuel, the parking, the depreciation, how much value it loses, and in other words, the percentage of what it costs when you first purchased it and how much value it loses over time. Yeah, all that, it's $5,000 to $10,000 a year for the average vehicle. And then oil, for the whole world, half of all the oil in the world is used for transportation. In California, 75% of the oil is used for transportation. Of all the oil used in California, 75% is for transportation. Okay, and then climate change, of course, is 1/4 of all the greenhouse gases in the world are from transportation. In California, it's about 50%. In California, about half of all the greenhouse gases that cause climate change, half is from transportation, mostly vehicles. And so we've created this transportation system, this car-centric monoculture, that not only has all those costs, but also it means that if you don't have a license or if you don't have enough money for a car, you are marginalized. It's really hard to get to work, to get to healthcare, to get to school, if you don't have access to a car. And there are people that are physically disadvantaged, and it's not just people in wheelchairs. For instance, I have a sister, and she had an accident when she was young, and she's perfectly normal, except she doesn't have peripheral vision on one side, and she can't get a license. So it's a lot more people than you think. And then you think about households where they might have one car, but there's 2 or 3 people, 2 or 3 adults, and they can't drive, only one of them gets to drive it to where they want to go. And sometimes that car is not very reliable, it breaks down. So if you put all that together, there's probably somewhere around 20% of the population that is marginalized by this car-centric system that we've created. And so how did we get here? Well, in the long ago past, we had lots of innovation in transportations. So I have this column here for passenger travel and goods movement. And you can see, these are the big, what I'll call transportation revolutions that have occurred. And for passengers, it was streetcars. That means cars that run on electricity, on rails in cities. What we now call light rail transit. The automobiles, the Model T became common around 1910, over 100 years ago. Airplanes about 1930, and then we started building freeways starting in the 1930s to 1950s, and then high-speed rail, which actually never came to California. We're missing out on that revolution so far. And on the freight movement, goods, we had canals, and then railroads, trucks, airplanes, and then containerization. So if you go to the port, you'll see most of the goods that are coming in are in these big boxes. And that was in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s where that happened. But then, what's important here is the last big change, the last big systems change in transportation was in the 1950s and 60s. We've seen very little innovation. Our cars, now they're safer and they're more energy efficient, but they're still 4 wheels, carry the same amount of people, go the same speed, fundamentally the same. Same thing with buses, same thing with rail. There's been no fundamental system changes in transportation until very recently. So, for me, I've been studying transportation for many decades, and some of these statistics here, or some of these data here is, as I said, transit is less than 2% of passenger travel. We tried carpooling. We built all these carpool lanes, but carpooling has actually gone down even as we've built more of these carpool lanes. Congestion is getting worse. Traffic fatalities, more people are being killed in traffic crashes than in the past. And greenhouse gases are increasing. So kind of this image here, this is a good LA image, right? There. But here's the image that I think really says a lot. That person could have gotten out and walked the dog. It would have saved a lot of energy. They would have gotten some good exercise. It wouldn't have spewed more greenhouse gases and pollution. So this is an extreme, but it kind of, to me, epitomizes it. So I had this epiphany about 6 or 7 years ago. I was in LA driving around with my wife, who's here, and this was the screen on the car. And this was the middle of a Saturday afternoon, and all these freeways are red, bumper to bumper. And I thought, Saturday afternoon, bumper to bumper on all the freeways, we've got to be able to do better than this. So that's where the motivation for a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and a recent book I wrote, the book in the right-hand corner, 3 Revolutions. So the idea is, how do we create a more sustainable, a better transportation system? And the idea is, let's look at actually new technologies that are either happening or about to happen. And so the 3 are electric vehicles, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. Another one is automated vehicles. People call them autonomous vehicles. But for all of you students, okay, you're science students, but think about English. Autonomous, what does that mean? It means it operates by itself without connections to anything. An autonomous vehicle is not autonomous. What we think of as an autonomous vehicle is connected to other vehicles. It gets information from traffic signals, from the other vehicles on the road. So it's automated, but it's not autonomous. So I've been on a campaign to call them automated vehicles, and I know it's a losing cause, but I'm going to continue sticking with it. So automated vehicles. And then the other revolution, so automated vehicles are just starting to happen. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the other one is the sharing revolution. And so really all of these got started about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. You know, the Tesla cars were about 2000. The Tesla cars, the Nissan Leaf were all just launched about that time. Uber and Lyft got started in 2010, you know, and that's the sharing part of the sharing revolution. And shared bikes and shared scooters came, you know, after that. And the automation actually became a thing around 2010. The history of it is Google. They're the ones that coined the term autonomous. You know, that's Silicon Valley thinking. In Silicon Valley, they just think they're going to, you know, what's the expression? You're going to make things until they break, or what is that expression? Okay, I'll remember it. So, you know, they think autonomously. They're going to solve the world's problems, but they're going to do it their own way. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so let's look at the first revolution, electric vehicles. So, and I use EVs as the shorthand for it. So what we've come to appreciate and understand is that if we want to decarbonize transportation, in other words, if we want to get to net zero emissions, if we want to create a future where we basically eliminate greenhouse gases, the most important thing we can do is convert electricity to renewable sources, get rid of natural gas and fossil energy and use renewable solar and wind mostly. But the second most important strategy to get to a decarbonized future is electric vehicles. And it's not just electric cars, but it's electric trucks as well. And so that's what I'm going to focus a lot on because it is so important. And I say here there's a strategy that many people talk about is reducing vehicle use and driving less. That's a real uphill battle. And if I have time, we'll see how this goes, that I'll talk a little bit about that. So the good news about electrification, vehicle electrification, is the car companies are on board. These are all announcements. They're all making announcements how they're going to, when they're going to give up making internal combustion engine vehicles, gasoline and diesel vehicles. And some a little sooner, some a little later, but all of them are on board. They all understand this is the future, and they understand it's a better future. And we'll talk about why it's not only better for climate, but for other reasons as well. Okay, so here's the next quiz of the day. What is the best-selling car model in the world? And so these are often what people think of as some of the candidates. So I'm going to ask you here, how many think it's the Ford 150 pickup truck? Okay, it looks like about 15-20%. How many think it's a Toyota Corolla? Yeah, a lot of enthusiasm. That's probably about 25%. How many think it's the Tesla Model Y? I see I think about 5 or 6 hands. Hardly anyone. How many think Honda Civic? All right, now we got another 25% or so here. Well, there's only a few of you that can congratulate yourself. It's the Tesla Model Y. Isn't that amazing? In the world, this is in the world. So, I'll give you a little hint about the Ford pickup truck. Hardly anyone buys the Ford pickup truck outside the US. It's the #1 selling vehicle in the US and has been for like 30 years, but nowhere else. Model Y, that's it. So what we're seeing is electric vehicles, the market growth is really tremendous. So the red line is the curve there, and you see around 2020, the sales really started taking off. And so right now, well, last year, about 13% of all vehicles sold in the world were electric vehicles. And this year, it's up quite a bit above that already. And the sad part of that story is the United States is way behind. So in China, which is the global leader on electric vehicles, they were 25% of all the cars sold there last year were electric vehicles. It's probably going to be close to 30% this year. That's a quarter to a third of all the vehicles sold already are electric vehicles. In Europe, it's almost that amount too. All of Europe, they have, I think they were 20% last year, and they are on a very steep trajectory. The US, last year was 4%. This year it's 7%, so it is going up. But we're all in California, so we can pat ourselves on the back a little bit because California is way ahead of the rest of the country. So for California, it's over 20% and going up very steeply, whereas, as I said, the US is about 7%. And I should point out also, I'm going to talk about California a little bit more, but the European Union, Europe, is adopting a rule that requires every single vehicle sold by 2035 to be electric vehicle or zero emitting. That's only 12 years away. Every single one. You won't even be able to buy a gasoline or diesel car. And you know what? The same thing in California. So I should say, as I said, I was a member of the California Air Resources Board. So we are the agency, we are the regulators that adopted this rule for California. So in California, by 2030, so in 2026, 3 years away, 1/3 of all the vehicles sold must be zero emitting. 2030, just 7 years from now, that 2/3 must be electric or zero emitting, and 2035, it's 100%. So now the reason why the EVs have become so popular recently, government can say what it wants to, but in the end, people have to buy the vehicles, right? And people are buying the vehicles. By the way, how many people in here their family owns at least one electric vehicle? How many? All right, this is like, probably close to 50%. Okay, we're all way ahead of the rest of California and definitely way ahead of the US in this room. So the reason they've been successful is because the battery costs have come down so much. They've come down 90% in the last 15 years. 90% reduction in cost. And this is like a massive success story. And the other two massive success stories in the environmental energy world is solar energy and wind energy. Both of those also have had dramatic reductions in cost. So the dramatic reduction in battery cost means that electric vehicles have become much cheaper because an electric car is really simple. And it's really very reliable. So it runs with an electric motor. Now you think about it, Where do you come across electric motors in your life? You know, the refrigerator. Do you ever think of, you know, maintaining the electric motor in your refrigerator? No. And so these motors last, you know, essentially forever. And so the cars, you know, a car has something like a gasoline car has something like 5,000 moving parts in it. The electric vehicle has almost none. Very few. You don't have that complicated engine and the drivetrain and everything that goes with it. And so if you can get the battery cheap, the rest of the car is really cheap. And so now it should be the case that within 5, 6, 7, 10 years, that the cost of a new electric car will be very close to the cost of a gasoline car. But better than that, it requires, as I said, almost no maintenance, and the energy costs are much less because it uses much less energy than a gasoline car, and electricity is cheaper. So you end up, so here's a metric that we use, okay, those of you thinking about that are engineers and mathematical. We talk about the total cost of ownership. So that means we take the cost of the vehicle, and then, you know, we spread it out over the life of the vehicle. And then we have the cost of energy every year, every day, and then the amount of maintenance we have over time. And so the energy costs and maintenance costs are much less than for a gasoline car. And if the purchase cost of electric car comes close to gasoline, you end up saving a lot of money. So the total cost of ownership, remember that $5,000 to $9,000 number? So even today, for most people, for many people today and for most people within a few years, the total cost of ownership for an electric car is less than a gasoline car, if you take into account its total cost over time. All right, so battery costs, big success story. And so this is just an analysis that a few of us did for the state of California 2 years ago. And we analyzed just what I told you, the total cost of ownership, and we included even the cost of all the charging stations. And we found that by around 2030, the total cost to our economy, to us, would be about the same for electric vehicles as it is for gasoline. And then after that, it would be much less. Okay, so why do we even need to talk about mandates, you know, banning gasoline cars and doing all this policy to support electric vehicles if economically it's so attractive, or will be? Well, first of all, consumers, you and me, we don't buy an electric car or a vehicle or most other things based upon the total cost of ownership. We just look at it and we say, okay, how much does it cost? And does it cost more than I want to pay, or it costs more than a gasoline car? And that's the metric, that's the number we use. So that's part of it. Consumers don't use total cost of ownership as the decision variable. And in a more general sense, consumers tend to be conservative in the sense that in a case of electric vehicle, we worry about, well, what's it going to be if I want to sell it in 5 years? Is it going to retain its value? What's its resale value going to be? And I might think of like, I don't know what the price of gasoline is going to be. Heck, I don't know what the price of electricity is going to be. You know, that keeps going up, by the way. There's this idea of loss aversion. This is from psychology, and it turns out that people don't like to subject themselves to the risk of a loss. So if you're making a decision and there's a possibility that the car won't be worth as much or the energy costs will be more, you're less likely to take that risk than what a normal economic rational analysis would tell you should do. And then there's range anxiety, worrying about when am I going to get lost somewhere and not be able to get the car or I won't have enough range. And then what we're now calling charging anxiety is a lot of the charging stations, turns out, aren't real reliable. And sometimes you find it, the credit card reader doesn't work and so on. So people worry about all these things. They should, but it does affect their decisions. So this is a little more complicated, but let me tell you, if you read the papers a lot, you'll be hearing about the supply of all these critical materials and minerals we need for our batteries, and for other goods as well, but for batteries in particular. And so we worry about where is it going to come from. Do we have it in the United States? If we don't have it here, then we become dependent on others. The cobalt we need most of it's mined in the Congo, where they use child labor and do some other horrendous things in the mining. And then it turns out the geopolitics comes in. So if you look at this, the blue is the United States, and the gray on the left side, the dark gray, is China. So almost all the processing. So what happens is a lot of these minerals are mined like in the Congo or Australia, but then they send them to China for processing. And it turns out, if you look at processing, like 60, 70% of all processing of all these key materials is in China. And a lot of more than that of the batteries are produced in China. So if we get uptight, with politics about not wanting to deal with China, we're we have a problem. And so the question is, all these minerals exist in abundant quantities around the world, and including in the US. But we can't seem to build the mines to get those out because we're concerned about environmental impacts, water usage. We've got all kinds of permitting processes that companies have to go through. We have NIMBYism. You all know what NIMBYism is? Not in my backyard. So that's kind of a cute little way of saying that, people don't want a mine near them. They don't want a smokestack near them. They don't want a refinery near them. Lots of good reasons, but sometimes okay, I'm editorializing a little bit here. Sometimes it goes way too far. So I'm a YIMBY, by the way. Yes, in my backyard. And but that's more related to the housing issues. NIMBYism is a big problem with housing, that communities don't want more dense housing in their neighborhoods, and so people fight it. And that's where the YIMBY came in, but it's relevant here also. So this is a big issue, is what are we going to do about these minerals and these materials? Are we going to subsidize and encourage it in the United States? Are we going to encourage the manufacturing facilities that refine and process them? Because if we just relied on the market system, economics, the way the market system works is if there's a shortage, the price goes up and money is invested to deal with that shortage. Some of the old timers in the audience might remember back in the 1970s where we thought there was the Club of Rome, and we were worried about growth, and we were going to run out of everything. We were going to run out of minerals. We were going to run out of food. We were going to have starvation in the world. But the prices went up. There was a lot of investment, and almost none of it happened. The problem now, the challenge now is, will those investments and will those companies make those investments? Will policy support it? Or will other things get in the way? But there's before you get too depressed about all that, engineers, scientists, we have a big role to play with the technology, because we can change the battery technologies and we can change the materials used in them. So one innovation that's already happening in a major way is we're using less cobalt, because that story I told you about cobalt in the Congo is a true story. And so everyone wants to reduce dependence on that cobalt. And so now they've come up with new battery chemistries that use much less cobalt. And so there's ways of modifying the design, the chemistries of these batteries and the design of these batteries. And there, you know, in the short term and then the long term, there's entirely new ways of building batteries. So even though we've come down 90% in cost already, there's still a lot more reduction that's possible. Okay, let's talk about policy a little bit. As I told you, I'm a policy wonk. I love thinking about policy and how do we make better policies and how do we make policies that are going to make the world a better place. So even if you're in science and biology and chemistry and physics and engineering, policy is really important. So yes, we want a lot of you to be, brilliant scientists in the lab, but we also want you to be brilliant scientists understanding how the science relates to the rest of the world. So, okay, there's, basically as we think about it, there's two major types of policies. I can generalize all types of policies. And we refer to them as carrots and sticks. So a stick, as you can imagine, you beat someone or something to do something. A carrot, I know you can start relating this to your families and your parents and your kids, The carrot is that you induce their behavior by giving them something they want. If you want your little kid to play the piano and you give them, chocolate as a reward, that's a carrot. The stick is, okay, I'm making this up as I go along, so I might, hopefully I don't say anything inappropriate, but a stick might be, okay, if you don't play that piano for 1 hour, then you lose, then you have to go to bed at 7 o'clock, or, Okay, so you get it, carrots and sticks. So for electric vehicles, the carrots can be things like we're using public government money to subsidize building charging stations, to get companies and governments to build more charging stations. We give money to consumers. If you buy an electric car, we'll give you $5,000, which is what we do. The federal government now will give $7,500, and the state of California will give, depending on your income, up to $10,000 to buy an electric car. Okay, so those are all carrots. The sticks are telling the car companies, so this is how we actually do it in the real world. We tell the car companies, X% of your vehicles you sell must be electric. So like what I told you earlier in California, in 2026, 1/3 for every car company, 1/3 of your cars, the cars you sell, must be electric. And if you don't, you have to pay a big penalty. Was that a question? No. So 1/3 in 2026, 2/3 in 2030, and those are the sticks. That's the regulation. And so I'm going to summarize a whole bunch of research that's been done, including by myself and a lot of my researchers at UC Davis, is that at this point in time, the most effective policy is the stick. And that's because the car companies, they know how to make electric vehicles. And in fact, they're already committed to doing it. They don't want to do it too fast, and they'd rather stretch it out, and they'd like to do it on their own terms. But they're capable of doing it. They've got the technology. They've got the supply chains. And so at this point in time, really the stick is the most useful, most effective, because it turns out that we see that a lot in the US. You'll go to different states and communities, and car companies are just not even selling the cars there. They have them. They're not doing any marketing. But the states that have this zero emission vehicle mandate, there the sales are going up at a very steep rate. All right, so California is really a special case. we really have good reason to be proud to be Californians. And this is the history of California policy for transportation. So way back in 1990, California adopted a zero-emission vehicle mandate. It didn't work. You know, it said 10% of all sales must be zero emission in 2003. Obviously, that didn't happen. But this is an example going back. You know, government can say what it wants, but in the end, if it's the consumers that are making the real decision, the real choice. And they made the choice that the technology wasn't ready, and so on. So anyway, this is the whole stream. And so there's the two green boxes, the most recent ones here. Not only do we have this mandate for car companies, but we, the California Air Resources Board, adopted a rule that says that by 2036, 100% of all trucks must be zero emitting. And that means those big tractor trailer long hauls, the trucks at the port, pickup trucks, everything. And that's only 13 years away. And there's a trajectory going up to that as well. All right, I just looked at the time and I know I'm having a good time, but okay, I'm going to speed this up a little bit. All right, so this is the requirement I told you about for California, what the percentage requirement is every year going up to 2035. And an important point is when California adopts it, there's a special provision that's been made in federal law, the Federal Clean Air Act law, that said that any other state can imitate California on emission standards as long as those emission standards are more aggressive than the national EPA ones. And so all of California's are definitely more aggressive. So it keeps changing a little bit, about 15 states follow California. So what California does, in some ways, is more important than the federal government because California is leading and others are following. Okay, so I said trucks, same thing as cars, 2036, and it's a complicated rule. So one of the things about being a policy wonk and why it's both important and fun and interesting is there's a lot of details there. So some of the details here, for instance, okay, we say 2036, you read the newspaper, they never tell you any of the details. So the rule here is 100% 2036, but what it says is that for drayage trucks, those are the trucks that go to the port and back, those trucks, starting in 2024, all new trucks that are purchased, all new added trucks that are purchased must be zero emission for the ports. And, okay, so going all the way up. So actually, I just read a story this morning that, and so then there's, okay, and then there's the other fleets. There's government fleets that have separate rules, which are very aggressive, more aggressive than that 100% going up to 100% in 2036. They have to do it even much faster. And so what I just read is that all of these fleets, you know, everything from the UPS fleets to Amazon and all the local smaller fleets are all buying a lot of diesel trucks before January 1st. Because all these rules take effect January 1st. So there's a huge boom in diesel truck sales. Because if you have if you don't buy a new truck, then you're okay. It's only when you buy a new truck that it has to be zero emitting. So that's kind of a, you know, insight into how the real world works. And so you have to, you know, if you were an emperor or king, you know, you could really tell people exactly what to do and when. You know, we're not. So we have to accept some of these little perturbations, we'll call it. Okay, charging. You know, we got to get charging out there. So the problem with charging is that it's almost impossible to make a profit, to have a business model just selling electrons to vehicles, because you don't sell that much electricity unlike a gasoline, it all gushes out in 3 minutes and you got a whole tank full. Here it takes, half an hour, and you get much less energy you'd sold. And so there's all kinds of problems. So people living in apartment buildings, a lot of chargers are unreliable. You see that little thing about Tesla, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, is that Tesla, whatever you think of Elon Musk, and I'm sure in this crowd there's a lot of negative thoughts, but what Tesla has done is really, truly amazing. I mean, they've done so many innovative things, and they've done so many things right. And one of the things is they built a charging network that is very reliable and very easy to use, and none of the others are. Okay, so to build charging, though, this is where it connects up to the electricity system. The amount of electricity that's needed at these charging stations, especially as we move into trucks, because trucks are big, they have huge batteries, and the amount of electricity you got to feed into that is massive. And so here you just see the part when in the red oval there. We're going to need, these charging stations are going to be bigger, supply more electricity than a small city for one big charging station for trucks and cars. So how is that going to happen? And you got the grid, you got to build it, back to NIMBYism, getting new transmission lines built, getting new chargers and transformers and everything else. All right, so some of the interesting policy questions is down below there. A lot of the car companies are saying, I give up, I'm going to just design my electric cars to be compatible with the Tesla superchargers, and they made a deal with Tesla so that Tesla would make their chargers available to people that buy these new cars. And so Ford, GM, Volvo, and a few other companies already have agreed to switch to a Tesla charging. So one of the policy questions is, even apart what you think of Elon Musk again, who seems to be taking over the world in many ways, and this is another example of it, but the Tesla superchargers are really high quality, easy to use, reliable. To what extent do we kind of defer or allow Tesla to become the dominant charging infrastructure company? Okay, so that's an open question. All right, hydrogen. So I'm not getting into hydrogen except to say that when I say zero emitting, it could be hydrogen, because the way hydrogen works is hydrogen can be made in many ways. Right now, it's mostly made from fossil energy, but it can be made from renewable energy. From basically, you take a water molecule, H2O, and you just pull the hydrogen out of it, and you use electricity. You use renewable electricity, solar electricity, and to split it, and now you have hydrogen that's zero carbon, because it's not carbon, and it took no carbon to make it. And then you feed it into a fuel cell. And this is a device that we can put in the car, and what it does is it takes the electron off of the hydrogen molecule and creates a circuit to run the motor. So it's zero emitting, it uses an electric motor, it's an electric car, but it's run on hydrogen. And any day now, sometime in the next week or two, you're going to read the federal government is going to announce giving out $8 billion to a number of entities around the country to really vastly expand hydrogen, not just for vehicles, but for other uses as well. And California is almost definitely going to be getting one of those 7 or 8 that are chosen. And so hydrogen is going to become a big hot topic in California in the next year or two, and next few weeks, actually. Okay, revolutions 2 and 3, and I know I'm way over time, so let me go through. So this is, the idea here is that if we can make our vehicles electric and that they're automated, but they're automated and used as a public transportation vehicle. Like, think of a Uber pool on steroids. It can be a small bus or, like a van, and it picks up numerous people, and it's combining the idea of, Uber and Lyft, where it's on demand, you press a button, it comes, picks you up. You might have to take a slight detour, but if there's lots of people using it, the detour is very minimal. And in that way, you greatly reduce vehicle usage, and it's electric, so what is used is zero emitting. So that's, to summarize, that's the heaven scenario for the future of how to create truly sustainable transportation. And it has all kinds of benefits, including an equity benefit. And that's because, I talked about all those people that either because of money or physical limitations are marginalized. Well, now you have a relatively inexpensive public transportation service. So with a small amount of subsidy, people that don't have much money could be given access to it, and they would get the same kind of mobility that everyone else does at a very small cost. So that's why this is, the heaven scenario. Okay, so I'm getting ahead a little bit. Automated vehicles. The picture on the right there is a vehicle that General Motors is about to start manufacturing, which is totally automated, has no steering wheel, no brake pedals, no people to run it, and it holds, you can see, 5 or 6 people. And so this is a vehicle that is intended to do just what I said. When I visited them a few years ago, they told me, your 3 revolutions, well, we're building it for you. And so that is, okay, so there it is. Okay, here's another, I think this is my last quiz question. Okay, so if we have automated vehicles, if they're personally owned, in other words, instead of just buying a manually driven vehicle, but you you buy it as an automated vehicle, what will be the result? Will you drive or be driven about the same as the current vehicle you have? Will it be 50% more, or will it be 100% or more? Okay, how many think the same? Okay, just a few of you, less than 10%. 50% more. That looks like about half to half. How many think doubling or more? And that's about a third. Well, the answer is we don't know yet, but almost definitely, according to all the research we've done, it's more than doubling. So here's a study we did. We gave people a car, and we gave them a chauffeur. Everyone would have loved to be in that study, right? And they could just be driven anytime, anywhere. And in that case, it got 80% increase in vehicle miles traveled. But that's a case where the car is not, tailored or designed, to be automated. It doesn't have all the good things in it, an entertainment system and so on, or office. Because an automated car, it can be an office, it can be a hotel room, entertainment center. All right, so here's what I mentioned about carpooling. Back before we had carpool lanes, this is for the United States, for commuting trips, 20% of all trips were carpools. And then by 2015, after we built all these carpool lanes, it dropped to 9%. When I was at the National Academies at Transportation Research, I cited this, and they got all, upset because many of them had participated in building the carpool, all the traffic engineers. Okay, so, and then there's automated vehicles. Okay, so this is a blog op-ed I just wrote, just got published 2 days ago. And this is the title: Don't Fall Prey to the Current Panic Over Automated Vehicles. So any of you that have been reading the papers lately, you'll see that there's been this big controversy because about 2 weeks ago, the state of California, the Public Utilities Commission said that General Motors could operate their fully automated vehicles in San Francisco anytime, any place in the San Francisco area. And lots of people got upset, especially in San Francisco. They said the cars block the fire engines and, stop for no good reason in the middle of an intersection. And so there's been this real backlash. So I got really annoyed with all those stories. LA Times even, they did an editorial couple weeks ago also on this. Everyone piled on, talking about all the problems. Well, none of them talked about why it's a good thing. And, these shared automated vehicles that I'm talking about, they're going to reduce vehicle use. They're going to improve safety. And okay, it's maybe a little, to use a bad metaphor, a bumpy road getting there. But this is almost certainly, the trajectory, the potential. So anyway, so I had a few slides on vehicle use, and I'm not going to, okay, I'll give you one last quiz. Okay, vehicle miles per capita. How has that been changing? Okay, forget the pandemic for now, because that distorted things. The last 10 years, has vehicle use per capita, has it increased, stayed the same, or gone down? Oh, per person. Okay, so on average, for the average person, in terms of how much they drive a vehicle, use a vehicle, has that gone up or down or stayed the same? Okay, how many think the amount of traveling has increased the last, oh my gosh, like 80%. Okay, how many think it stayed flat? Okay, a few. How many think it's decreased? And a few again. Well, it's been flat, but I thought that was surprising. Okay, so anyway, here's just a nice fun graphic, why we worry about vehicle use. This is a great graphic. So if you had 60 people, how much space does it take up if they drive cars, if they take a bus, or they ride a bicycle? Okay, I don't need to comment on that, I guess. All right, so, okay, my last slide, last thought. I think we need a new way of thinking about the future and about technology and about the opportunities. Right now, if you talk to a mayor or city council, which I've done a lot of the last few years, all they want to talk about is scooters are cluttering the sidewalks. Uber and Lyft are causing more congestion and pollution. And now they're talking about automated vehicles blocking fire trucks and police. Well, I would suggest they should be thinking and acting a little more strategically and thinking about how can we take advantage of all these innovations in a way that's in the public interest, that's better for society, better for cities, better for us. Using bikes and e-bikes and scooters and pooled ride-hailing and on-demand transit, shared automated vehicles. That's why I wrote that op-ed. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.